This story caught my eyes ahead of King Charles's state visit to Kenya, which begins on Tuesday. One Harvard professor has said that the King should apologise for atrocities committed by the British Army during the Mau Mau revolt over the 1950s. Now, during his visit, Charles will lay a wreath at Kenya's tomb of the unknown warrior and view the Mungo fig tree, Mugumo, I think I got that right, the Mugumo fig tree planted at the site of the declaration of Kenya's independence in 1963. But Professor Caroline Elkin says that he should go further and say the word sorry. So the question is, should King Charles apologise for the actions of the British Empire? I'm going to start with you, Ben Habib, should he?
Well, it's really interesting, you know, the leap made from what happened in the 1950s to present day and requiring an apology, without really justifying why an apology is being requested, for what purpose. This is a very unusual look back at the dying embers, if you like, of the British Empire, because in this particular instance, the case was taken to court in 2013. £20 million of reparations was adjudicated in favour of the families, in a British court, by the way, which is a testimony to what a great system we have here, because we hold ourselves to account. £20 million of reparations were awarded to 5,000 surviving members of what happened in the 1950s. But the bigger point here is that there are consistent and coordinated attacks on British culture and history, and we've seen it with Black Lives Matter. We've seen it with accusations of this country having made all its fortune on the back of the slave trade, the empire being an unmitigated force for evil. All these things are wrong. We should not be apologising for what happened 100, 200 years ago. We can't possibly begin to judge those events through the prism of the way we see the world at the moment. None of the people who they claim were abused are alive. None of the abusers are alive. And actually, the British Empire, on the whole, was a force for good. And I believe that to the core of my soul. We exported British values of justice, we established human rights, we abolished the slave trade, we then policed the high seas in order to make sure that the slave trade was shut down. We didn't just abolish it ourselves, we went out to enforce that abolition. We exported our common law system to the world, for which so many nations have benefited. And yes, we built schools, we built railways, and we were actually a force for good. And there are no doubt events which call into, no doubt events which we should be less proud of, where people were killed. But this desire to make us apologise is nothing short of a desire to bring the United Kingdom to its cultural knees, and we've got to resist it and refuse to do it.
Peter Edwards.
Well, as to whether an apology is appropriate, I'd like to be guided by how people of Kenya actually feel about it. But I think where I part company from Ben, perhaps, is that this is not some distant event from 200 years ago. The Mau Mau revolt was put down very brutally by Britain in the 1950s. So, that's post-war, that's within the era of TV, of radio. It's relatively recent. And I think Ben used the word largely unmitigated success. I would take nearly the polar opposite view of the British Empire, because I think Britain got rich on the back of killing people, and I think we're enjoying that financial benefit today.
Well, hang on. So you're going even further back and saying that. I think sometimes the historical context is seen in an odd light, because the slave trade, for example, which would be one of the things that you're referring to many, many hundreds of years ago, would be the thing that you think is one of the things that I'm presuming was one of the things that made Britain as wealthy as it is now. But I think you've got to realise that the slave trade was going on in Africa before the British arrived. So that was a trade within Africa that was perfectly legitimate and legal. And the British cottoned onto it, came to Africa, and then the Africans sold their people to become slaves. So I think, whilst you say, the Britain got rich on the back of the slave trade and things like that, this was a trade, and actually the British stopped it, but it's still going on in Africa now. There's over 700,000 slaves. So I find it incredulous that people continue to go on, Britain did this, that and the other, when that trade was happening in Africa before the British came. The Africans sold their people to become slaves. And, of course, the British then decided, after the deaths across the seas and the way it was all going, it really was inhumane, and it absolutely was, and they stopped it. But it's still going on in Africa. Sorry.
Oh, do you want me to answer that? Yeah, quickly. So, I mean, you use the phrase legal and legitimate. So
at the time, yes.
Yeah, it was legal, but not legitimate. And I think in terms of the issue
well,
about...
at the time it was.
No, I don't think it was. Absolutely
was
wasn't.
Not legitimate?
Because...
at the time, you're looking at the prison now.
There's a question about whether we're imposing modern values 200 years ago, but killing people in the pursuit of British Empire was wrong. And there was a debate about it at the time, particularly from ministers of religion in several faiths, not just the Church of England. There were and civil groups, and also they looked and sounded different today. But there was a debate about the evils of empire and the violence of empire.
At the time, it was legal and legitimate. That is at the time.
Why wouldn't use the word legitimate?
Well,
it was legal.
Yeah, but I would at the time. But
well, legitimate is derived from the word legal.
No, I'd attach a moral weight to that word.
Well, that's how they saw it. And then eventually they decided that it wasn't acceptable. But they wouldn't have done it if they hadn't have thought that. And at the time, that's what they thought. Now, we've all acknowledged that it isn't right. It certainly isn't legitimate and it should never happen. But what I'm saying is, my point is that it is still going on in Africa. And it was happening there before the British got here. And I find it just incredible that people continuously act as though the British brought slavery. No, they didn't. They didn't.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, every single country in the world has participated in the slave trade at a point in their history. But the other thing I want to just important thing to cite is our wealth, by the way, is not driven purely through the empire. It was the agrarian revolution, which was then succeeded by the industrial revolution. Amazing technological advancements made by the United Kingdom. The harnessing of fossil fuels for the first time that propelled us forward. The richest time in British history actually was after we abolished the slave trade.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And we then championed and established human rights way ahead of other countries. And we did it when we were in a position of power, when there was no obligation to do it. We weren't doing it in retreat. We were doing it when we were at the zenith of our power. And I completely refute this notion that you can look back through the British history and say the empire was unmitigated evil. I mean, it absolutely was not. Loads of European countries were aspiring to have empires. Loads of European countries had empires. And let me tell you, the European empires were ruthless by comparison to the British Empire. The Dutch and the Belgians, for example, wouldn't give 2 seconds thought to killing. I think it was Leopold who killed 2 million people in the Congo.
I mean, are we going to apologise for our behaviour now? Like, for example, the things, the mining of lithium, the mining of some of these rare earth minerals, that a lot of them, we know that there's a slave trade going on with some of those things, even some of the clothes we're wearing. Are we going to now apologise to the people who we are treating, who are enslaved, to give us the wealth that we require? Because where does it end?
Well, this is where today we've got to recognise what slavery means, because it had a legal status, however abhorrent, 200 years ago. But there are people in West Africa today, I think I defer to others, but mining things like titanium that go in electronic equipment and mobile phones. They may not be what might be legally slaves, but they're absolutely exploited, and obviously many are dying as part of that work.
They are slaves. That's what... I mean, you had the people who built the Qatar stadiums dying because, they were basically refugees and people who've gone there, and they were literally enslaved.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there we have them. But people are still harping on about something in 19-something, when right now, a couple of years ago, was it only a year ago? When was the World Cup? Was it last year, was it? Gary Lineker and a load of people went off to Qatar, which the stadiums are sat in stadiums that have been built by slaves. Why is nobody looking to apologise for that? Why are we not demanding an apology there?
May I answer that briefly before going to Ben? So I think, as you say, we're horrified by what's going on in West Africa today. We're horrified by the deaths and the construction, particularly in Qatar in the run-up to the World Cup. The reason we're having a debate about Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and the wider history of British slavery, because it was a British state as well as companies. As I understand it these days, it's the private sector, if the titanium bits are going in mobile phones, that's a private sector rather than the British government, for example. But it's wrong anyway. Wrong is wrong.
But then the whole argument is the moral argument. It's not who's the person behind it. So if we're being so moral about it, then why, I bet half these people that are demanding some sort of apology are quite happy.
But the Qatari government, I understand your question, but the Qatari government's not going to apologise year
Of
after the
course
World
they're
Cup.
not.
And
Of course
a
they're
mobile
not.
phone company
course
is
they're
not
not.
going to want to touch it with a barge pole.
That's my point.
That
Of
it's
course they're
important to
not.
recognise that these things are happening and people are dying.
Yes, but there's no point.
And by the way,
to
the
it.
Qataris are in bed with the Iranians. Let's not forget that either, in the context of Gaza and Israel, which we've been discussing recently.
So it just seems a lot of people sitting on a moral high chair saying the British Empire, almost sort of like inflating an ego of what they are, what the British Empire is. The reality of it is that it's still all going on right now. We could be apologising. We'll be apologising forever.